Okay. Uh, a car hire company hires cars to customers. Each time a car is hired, this is treated as a transaction. So when a car is hired, this is treated as a single transaction, and for each transaction the following data is stored. Okay, so we're going to store the customer name for the transaction. In this transaction we're going to store the customer name, and we're going to store the ID number. So these two things belong to the customer, right? And then to complete the information about the car that has been hired, we are going to input the car registration number. We're going to save the car registration number, I should say. So we're going to save the car registration number. We're going to save the date on which this car has been hired, and we are also going to save the number of days for which this car has been hired. So we're going to have something like this. We're going to, for a single transaction, Mr. Joe, for example, whose ID is 15679, this is the customer detail, right, for a transaction, will has hired the car with the car registration number 123, and the hiring date is 1st of January 2017, right, and this has been hired for 5 days. So that's the way to think about it, right? This is a single transaction. This is the customer name, this is the ID number, so this is the data related to the customer, right? This is our sample data related to the customer, and when a car gets hired, this is the hiring information in the transaction, right? So the car registration number, which is 123, the date on which the car was hired, and the number of days for which this car was hired. Okay, so all of this is basically a single transaction, and the transaction data is stored in a text file called hire trans. So this is the name of our text file. This file is made up of this file is made up of a file body and a file trailer. Okay, we'll take a look at the structure chart that he has given to determine what we are going to do with this. Okay, so don't think too much about this for now, but just know that this is an information that he has provided, that the file is made up of a file body and the file has a file trailer. So they basically, he split the file up into two parts. One is the file body and one is the file trailer. Okay, and then he says that the file body has one transaction stored on each line. So each line in the text file that we have is going to store a single transaction. So all of this detail, which is our sample detail, is going to be stored on a single line, right? That is what the question is saying. All of this detail is going to be stored on a single line. Okay, so let's take a look at this, right? So what is he saying here? The first step in Jackson structured programming is to produce a Jackson structured programming data structure diagram. So we want to produce a data structure diagram, and by a data structure diagram, what we mean is how is the data structured for this scenario. How is the data structured? We are not worried about processing at all. We are saying how is data structured in this scenario when a transaction occurs, right? Where is the data saved, what kind of values are saved, right? So that is what we are worried about. We are not worried about what processing needs to be done. Okay, so we are going to complete this JSP diagram. Okay, so this is our file, right? Hire trans, and now there is a hint right here, and the hint is that one part of this split is the file body, right? Obviously, if this is the file body, then this part is going to be the file trailer, right? So there is a hint that has been given in the question. So we're going to take this hint, and this is what we're going to fill up, right? Okay, then within file body, a single transaction is stored on a single line. Okay, and the transaction data is stored in this hire trans file, right? So on a single line, a single transaction is stored, right? So what is this telling us? What is this piece of information telling us? That F body has one transaction on each line. When he's saying this, it has one transaction on each line, then this means that there are multiple lines, because he's saying one transaction on each line. He's emphasizing each line, which means what? He's trying to say there are more lines, and on each line there is one transaction. Okay, and that transaction is calling what? Trans. So on each line of the file body we have one transaction. Okay, which basically means what? We are going to have multiple transactions. We are going to have multiple transactions within the file. So this file is going to store multiple transactions, right? So this is what we need to fill up here, right? So the file body is so the file body is going to have multiple transactions, where one transaction is called what? Trans. In case you have something that is done repetitively, or that, for example, in this case, we are going to have multiple transactions, right? So in case something is multiple or something is being done repetitively, then we are going to use a steric sign to indicate the number of repetitions, or to indicate that something is happening more than once. So transactions are going to be stored more than once in the file body. So we are going to store more than one transaction, and this is something that is going to happen repeatedly. A transaction is going to store, a new customer is going to walk in, a new transaction is going to be stored. So this is what keeps on happening repeatedly. That's why we have indicated this trans with a steric here, that there are going to be multiple transactions within the file body. Okay, so we have explained that there are going to be multiple transactions within the file body. Now these transactions need to be elaborated, because this is where we are simplifying the transactions, right? This is where we are simplifying the transactions. And remember, this particular diagram is about data, right? This particular diagram is about data. So this is what it says. This is a JSP data structure diagram. So what kind of data are we going to store as far as the transaction is concerned, right? What kind of data are we going to store? So here what we've said is that multiple transactions are going to be stored. In a file body, multiple transactions are going to be stored. Now we want to give more detail about the transaction. So here we have to say what kind of data is going to be stored in a transaction. We are providing more information, right? So let's take a look at what the question says. The question says that this is the data that is stored for a single transaction. So these are the details that we need to provide right here, right? When a transaction occurs, this is the data that is saved, right? And the data that is saved is basically of two types. There is customer related data, and there is the hire related data, right? These are the two kinds of data that are going to be saved, right? The hire related data and the customer related data for a single transaction, right? So what kind of data are we storing about the customer? We are storing the customer name, and we are storing his ID number. So that is exactly what we are going to provide. So here's what we've said. In a transaction, we are storing two types of data. We are storing the customer data, we are storing the hire data. And now we want to elaborate on the customer. For a customer, we are saving these two types of data. We are saving the ID number, right? So that's further detail that we have provided to the customer, right? Customer data. And we are storing the customer name, right? We are storing the customer name. So that's so we provided more detail in the next step. So this is more detail about the customer, right? And now how about the hire data? What are we storing as far as hire data is concerned? First, we are storing the car registration number, right? We are storing the car registration number. We are also storing the date of hire, the date on which this car was hired, and we are also storing the number of days for which this car got hired. So we've completed our diagram here, JSP diagram, and there was only one thing that we needed to be careful about, and that was that the file body contains what kind of data. In general, a file body contains transactions, and it does not contain a single transaction, but it contains multiple transactions, and to indicate that we've used the steric sign. And then we tried to expand on transactions. for a single transaction, we are storing these two pieces of information, right? The customer data and the hire data, right? So we have described a transaction, a single transaction in more detail here, right? And then we are going to elaborate on that further, right? For a customer, for a single customer, we are going to store his ID number and his customer name once only, right? Not multiple times, but once only, once per transaction, right? Because remember, this is the root, right? We started from here. This is the transaction, right? And for each transaction, we are saving customer data and we are saving hire data. As far as customer data is concerned, we are going to save his ID number and his customer name for that transaction, right? And then for hire, we are going to save what? For hire data, we are going to save the car registration number, the date of hire, and the number of days. So I hope you understand how this works.